Welcome to this lecture on Machiavelli's The Prince, the dedication through chapter 11. And I know that there is an online edition of this version that I had assigned the Dover Thrift edition, so the page numbers might not exactly correspond, but the chapters will, and I do ask that you use the Dover edition. A, it's very cheap, and B, then we're working with a consistent text, and my quotations will make sense to you because they'll be the same in your version. The text is dedicated to Lorenzo de' Medici, who ruled Florence in the early 16th century from 1516 to 1519. Recall that the de' Medicis had regained control over the Florentine Republic in 1512, and Machiavelli had worked during that reign between the de' Medici rule, so a brief 16 years or so when Florence wasn't ruled by the de' Medicis. He's suspected of spying and briefly jailed, but then the charges are not pressed any further against him. So why does Machiavelli dedicate the prince to Lorenzo? The practical reason is that he hopes that somebody can unify Italy, as he thought Cesare Borgia could have done. But nobody really knows. It does seem like kind of an odd move, given that the de' Medicis had kicked Machiavelli out of his government position, and in fact, several of them which he held with several great accomplishments to his credit. It's even thought, like, because the prince has something of a very shrill and strident political tone, that maybe it's meant as a satirical text and a send-up of the Mirror for Princes genre. Let's see how he frames this book as a gift to Lorenzo de' Medici. He says that he's going to eschew the usual presents for a prince: horses, armor, cloth of gold, precious stones, and the like costly gifts. We'll recall that Gerald of Wales did a similar thing, that he said to Henry II, "Oh, I might have brought you back some souvenirs from Ireland, but instead I've brought you this travel narrative." So similarly, we're supposed to think, yeah, Machiavelli, thanks to his political expertise, is going to give the new ruler not these usual gifts, but in fact an advice book. So on the one hand, we might think that, yeah, this is kind of a tasteless gift. It's like giving somebody soap or perfume as a present. Anytime I've gotten gifts like that, I wonder what I'm secretly being told. But in fact, the text is part of a long and storied tradition. The Mirror for Princes advice books that offer models for the prince in which he might emulate and craft himself towards. So the text itself is thought to be a mirror, and the examples that are given are ways that the prince might fashion himself as a ruler. Additionally, using like language relevant to a gift, Machiavelli turns to describing his prose. So he's not going to give the prince gold, and he's not going to use golden prose. So he says, "This work I have not adorned or amplified with rounded periods," so that refers to fancy handwriting, "swelling and high-flown language, or any of those extrinsic attractions and allurements wherewith many authors are wont to set off and grace their writing." So he's also not going to make his language of the advice book fancy. So on the one hand, I see this as Machiavelli's appeal to the fact that he's using vernacular Italian as opposed to Latin, which might have been a more natural choice for a book that is part of a long and illustrious tradition. On the other hand, yeah, another brilliant rhetorical move on Machiavelli's part, in addition to reflecting on the fact that he's going to use the humbler language. This makes it sound as if he's going to be more no frills and thus honest. He tacitly posits a claim to truthfulness. saying the truth of its matter and the importance of its subject should alone recommend it. So I don't need to gild this lily because it's already perfect and wonderful and gets the job done. Another way that Machiavelli's text is similar to Gerald of Wales's is that we get a sense that geography is not a neutral field of study, but rather is always already politicized. So here is a quote from Machiavelli's text there in the dedication to Lorenzo de' Medici. For as those who make maps of countries place themselves low down in the plains to study the character of the mountains and elevated lands, and place themselves high up on the mountains to get a better view of the plains, so in like manner, to understand the people, a man should be a prince, and to have a clear notion of princes, he should belong to the people. So right there, Machiavelli admits that a map is a political entity and thus provides a useful paradigm for explaining what he's going to do in his advice book for princes. So the map is not a neutral entity. It contains both highs and lows, and perspective and bias are a natural part of a map, which is not an idea really that we are used to, I don't think. Like I think you get a sense of diverse lands looking at a map, but do you really get a sense of perspective and what it would be like to be in those places from looking at a map? And I'd have to say no. So this is kind of a medieval idea of a map as an allegorical device that conveys cultural meaning rather than just neutral bland facts like, okay, this country is next to this country, here's the river, here's the boundary. I also think that there's here an implication of conquest in that, well, to flip my question, why would you give political advice using the map as a analogy? So yeah, a lot of what the prince talks about is acquiring lands, and so I feel like he's already getting his feet wet about that idea right there in the dedication. And one of the final notions that he ends the dedication with, a prince should belong to the people. So you'll see this idea rehashed throughout the text. Indeed, like, what kind of relationship should the prince have with the populace? So I'm going to tease that out a little bit. Yeah, so what does this mean that the prince should belong to the people? So on the one hand, it means, yes, he should know the people. And as you will see, it's not really to get the warm fuzzies from them, but really to be able to rule over them better. So the text develops this idea in more detail. But I think it also accounts for Machiavelli's example-driven text. So saying that the prince should be of the people, he doesn't really imagine, that the prince is a popular figure per se. I think it also resonates with the idea that the prince, in the last analysis, is a Frankensteinian monster, as I say here. As you'll see, the prince that Machiavelli ultimately winds up describing borrows good characteristics from a variety of different predecessing rulers. Here, I'm just going to give you a drill down of the different types of princedoms that he talks about in the part of the text that you read for this week. So he alleges that there are two basic types. So hereditary and new. And then of the new princedoms, so the ones that is newly acquired or conquered, they could be conquered by arms or merit, or by the aid of others and by good fortune. So as you go through and read the text, like, see which side of these little debates he comes down on. So does he prefer hereditary or new? And then within new, which of those two does he prefer? So new for sure is more complicated because he's got a few more provisions and questions you have to ask yourself. If we're dealing with a new princedom, you have to ask, what path to power does he see the prince using to acquire his princedom? So is it via crimes and vicious behavior, or is it via civil relations with the people and his allies? Then there's a third type in addition to hereditary and new, and that is called mixed. And I think that we can learn a lot from seeing how Machiavelli deals with this quote unquote gray area in chapter 3, in that he largely, I don't think, really tolerates a gray area very well. He ultimately thinks, yeah, how can I make this system more legible? And thus it doesn't really tolerate gray areas super well. The title of chapter 10 is How the Strength of All Princedoms Should Be Evaluated. And even though he engages here in a lengthy discussion, it really does boil down to one thing: how well the princedom is fortified. As you'll see looking at that chapter, this comes to imply several different things. And so it really does reflect on the prince's own power. So here I've said the social body implies the prince's own body. So being able to fortify your region, it keeps the people safe, but it also reflects on your own personal virtue, as Machiavelli might put it. It suggests, as he reflects frequently in the text, that a prince must always be not only prepared for war, but even seeking out wars. A skillful use of allies, which he talks about in the part of the text that you have to read for next week. He goes into a lot of detail about what types of allies are useful, but this fortification, I think, is literal and then has many layers to it that imply these other things. And yeah, last but not least, it is a physical wall. And so in Game of Thrones, that wall, even though it's way up in the hinterlands of northern Westeros, really does govern a lot of our thinking, in that the guys right now at this point in the franchise are, kind of doing a whole lot of nothing. They're protecting the Seven Kingdoms from some kind of invisible threat that may or may not be coming. And there's even questions like, do we need this wall? And so I can see Martin, in addition to the fact that these are something of warrior cultures depicted in Game of Thrones, also with that your obsession that keeps rearing its head with the wall, I feel like comes from Machiavelli. In chapter 11, he deals with ecclesiastical princedoms, and by that I do believe that he means the very particular type of power that has recently, at his point in history, been assumed by the papacy. So it's not that the Pope rules over a particular region per se, but that he is the power behind the throne, so to speak, in many secular regions. And so you notice that he talks about this one separately. It's hereditary and new is his main type of his main way of categorizing normal princedoms, and then you have ones that are inherited, and then some parts of it have been added onto it. So it's like, okay, that's the normal course of action. But ecclesiastical princedoms, if you'll pay attention, is a recent phenomenon at his time. He admits that they are difficult to evaluate because they are set up and supported by God himself. So I know that I felt kind of relieved then when he said he gave backhanded credit, or probably in Machiavelli's mind, he gave due credit to Pope Alexander VI, Cesare Borgia's dad, for making the church into a temporal power. So I feel like, as I was reading along, I'm thinking, okay, he's doesn't have the rose-colored glasses on, thinking that the church is in this capacity and organ for spiritual benefits, toward the lay people, and not necessarily a divine organ. Like, he recognizes that thanks to this pope, it now has a bit of temporal power and political weight. So here's a quote that he says, he uses to describe Pope Alexander VI. More than any of his predecessors, showed what a pope, so this Pope Alexander VI, he showed what a pope could effect with money and arms, achieving the instrumentality of Duke Valentino, which is another name for Cesare Borgia. So he goes on to note that, yeah, like, gaining power for the Vatican really was just a byproduct of Alexander's desire to amplify his own son's career. And before this, Machiavelli gives several examples of how it was either the church was not successful in wielding temporal power, or it was thought to be kind of unsavory. But there's a tide change with the reign of Alexander the Sixth, and really it's kind of quote unquote by accident that the papacy has become so powerful. So he mentions a few popes that have come after Alexander that have further aggrandized the church's power. So Julius II, and then the current pope, Pope Leo X, who dies in 1521, the first of three de Medici popes, toward whom Machiavelli gives this advice, that he should use his virtue to strengthen it further. So he doesn't use this exact word because our translation is in English, but when he speaks there about putting his virtues to good and vibrant, vital use, like, this is what he's talking about, like being kind of pushy, having some grit and some chutzpah. So yeah, for those of you like kind of disenchanted with this chapter where he not only recognizes but applauds the hard fact that the papacy is now a force to be reckoned with, it has the ability to rule almost anywhere because it's not specifically located anywhere, and that's what makes it, in part, what makes it so powerful. I feel like in his rehearsal of those earlier popes' careers, Machiavelli was implying that the papacy always entailed politics, that Pope Alexander made it a political power. And so, knowing what I know about the earlier Middle Ages, I'd have to say, yeah, it's the old familiar story that church and state are always messing with each other's spheres. So I think that the distinction that Machiavelli would draw is that, yeah, Pope Alexander VI was good at using the power of his papal throne to political effect.